Hey, hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming out to spend an hour of your valuable time during the summer and the heat to learn with us about new ways to view our relationship to the ecosystems in our own backyards and neighborhoods. This is a prelude to the environmental team's field trip to Long Branch Creek that will happen this Saturday morning. I'm Vicki Westberg, for those of you who know, past co-president of the Charleston Area League of Women Voters. I'm currently volunteering with the Natural Resources team here in Charleston. I would like to thank Kara Erickson for volunteering her social media skills for tonight, Judith Kramer, who keeps our local league connected to the State Natural Resources Working Group, and of course, a special thank you to tonight's esteemed guest speaker, Rebecca Fanning. I am going to stumble through a quick little screen share here. Oops. And there we go. Okay, we have some housekeeping requests for you tonight. Please mute yourself for the entire presentation. Turn off your video so we can focus on the presenters. Add your name so we know who you are. And just so you know, we ask that you refrain from using chat until the end during the Q&A session, and then that's when Rebecca will respond to questions in chat. And Judith will monitor the chat at that time. Okay, we like to always start our league events with a restate of our mission, which is the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization encouraging the informed and active participation of citizens in government. It influences public policy through education and advocacy, and we never support or oppose any political party or candidate. And now I would like to introduce our host for this evening, Judith Kramer. Judith volunteers as the liaison between our local league and the State League's Environmental Working Group. We're fortunate to have the opportunity to benefit from her many years of tireless efforts to educate the rest of us about how we humans fit into our environment and how we can turn negative impacts into positive ones. Judith is a South Carolina statewide master naturalist and educator, wildlife gardener, designer, coach, and lecturer. She works with the Dorchester County Heritage Preserve Land Use Committee, and she is a certified landscape designer and accomplished wildlife artist. For 43 years, Judith and her family have lived on a 2.5-acre patch of woods and gardens in the middle of downtown Somerville. Judith views this patch of land as a space shared with and in support of an incredible array of wildlife living among the trees and plants on one of the few remaining pieces of wooded land in Somerville's downtown area. She walks the walk and talks the talk on this subject. And with that, I will now turn it over to Judith, although we do need a moment for transition because one of our laptop cameras died on us and we are sharing the same laptop. So there'll be just one moment of transition here. Okay. I didn't change anything. It's just all still as it was.
Oh, okay.
So you can start, you can arrow or.
Yeah. Okay. So just want to thank you all for coming. And this is our 4th local event over the past year. The intent for me is to help people understand where we are in the environment What do you, oh, wait a minute.
Here we go.
And it's interesting because I woke up in the middle of the night last night to the sound of large equipment. And it's something that we take for granted every day, every minute of every day, had blown up in my neighborhood. The water main that was installed in the 1940s decided to give it all up last night. So I woke up to no water. And it was an interesting reminder of how fragile our dependency is on everything working just right and being the way we want it to be. So it's just sort of odd that it happened last night. So I welcome you all, and I wanted to also give you an idea of what the natural resources team is and does in our area. And it's an environmental study group to study the low country ecosystems. Our ecosystems are pretty unique, and so it's important when looking at them in the context of climate change to understand how, as I came to understand very clearly this morning, how our food, water sources, and air we breathe is very dependent on the daily decisions we make here locally. So our purpose is to further our understanding of nature and the importance of the natural world in which we live and how it sustains us all, humans and other than humans. I believe as a group, it is not possible to make fair and sustainable legislative decisions around the many facets of climate change without some understanding of the big picture. Who and what will be supported and who and what will not with any given piece of legislation working its way through local and or state government agencies. It is my hope through participation in our varied field trips and seminar webinars, a wider understanding and appreciation will develop for the natural world and the political ramifications of caring for it or not, and who will benefit and who will not. Rebecca's work feeds into this program beautifully. And let me introduce her. So Rebecca Fanning is a restoration ecologist and an environmental educator. She's been doing this for 10 years and has great experience in the marsh and river restoration in our beautiful low country. Rebecca is launching a nonprofit called Community Hydrology, whose mission is to foster land stewards for water bodies in the Charleston region using innate capacity of native plant communities to respond to and repair disturbances caused by problematic water management practices. She will be happy to answer questions after her presentation. And at this point, I will turn you over to Rebecca. Okay.
All right, everyone. Hello, and thank you so much for being here today. And it sounds like at least a few of you will be on the walk on Saturday. So I very much look forward to getting to meet you then, if not making your acquaintance today as part of my presentation on hydromodification in the Low Country. And on that note, allow me to get started. Okay, so on Saturday, we're visiting Long Branch. It is located here in the West Ashley area of Charleston, South Carolina, in the Low Country. And I spoke to the environmental working group of the League back in March and talked a lot about some issues that happened over the years in the Piedmont and how that continues to affect us today. But hopefully all of you live in the Charleston region, because this will be very low country specific. However, there's a number of different resources and links that'll be pertinent to anyone, anywhere in the United States, really broadly speaking, but certainly within the state. So hopefully you all will find this very interesting tonight, and will use some of the resources that I'll make mention of in this presentation to do some exploration of your own. And in that note, I should mention that everything in this presentation pretty much is a clickable link. For example, you can email me. There will be a PDF sent to you by the organizers, if not later on today, then tomorrow. And you will be able to click on the different aspects of this presentation to explore these tools. And just to demonstrate, I'm going to go ahead and click now on the aerial image overlay that I had there on that title slide. So perhaps you noticed there was a picture, old-timey picture from 1954, laid over a satellite image of current Charleston region. And I'm just going to go ahead and zoom right up to my house so you all can see what my area of town used to look like. And I'll go ahead and just put on some old archival imagery here, and we can start to explore how Charleston has changed, and specifically my part of West Ashley. So you can see that in 1954, I lived deep in the woods. And I think this is important to note, because there's a real tendency in environmental circles to point at new development as the evildoers, but every single one of us with a house over our heads at some point drastically altered the natural hydrologic regime of our watersheds when that watershed was developed at some point in time. And these aerial images are really interesting because you get a sense of how fast Charleston has grown in the 1950s. Much of West Ashley, which today you'd be hard pressed to find a farm field, was exactly that, farm fields. And there were some predominantly African-American settlement communities built up around Croghan Spur, the railroad, and different industries that were active in this area near the downtown peninsula at that time. But zooming back into Long Branch, we can see through these archival images how much that area has changed. And oops, if I get too close, then it stops working very well. Whew, let me back out for a second and see. I was in the neighbor creek, excuse me. Scale is difficult sometimes when you're zooming around too much. So we can see that the field trip will occur in the woods right here. Now there's not very many woods right here in the suburbs today. And it's sort of interesting. This isn't a Judith Kramer style woodlot in the middle of downtown Somerville. What on earth is it that's so special about these woods that they were saved the axe when everything else got built out pretty densely here in West Ashley? Turns out it's a city property. It's not a public park exactly. The public are welcome to go and explore there, but it's not a park. If it were a park, they'd probably cut down all the trees and put in some parking lots and ball fields anyway. But the reason why these woods have been conserved is because there's an old battery here on the banks of Long Branch. And for that reason, we still have the native woods there on that site, because it would be too costly, or the archaeological value of it is so high. It's been preserved in a semi-natural state. However, even in 1950, we can see many markers of changes over the years. There's rice dikes here, there's phosphate scars there. Certainly these fields at one time were just filled to the brim with Sea Island cotton that liked that humid environment along creek beds. And those phosphate scars are much more visible if you come further down to the mouth of Long Branch on the Stono River. These scars on the landscape are mine pits, essentially, and the high areas were where they carted those phosphate rocks and put them on barges and railroads to get them to processing facilities along the Ashley River. Those scars are still there, as we can see from the satellite imagery of this area. And so that is not a functioning tidal marsh system. It is mostly ruts and ditches through the ground. And this is an incredible loss. When you're a restoration ecologist, you're always looking for opportunities to maximize the potential of natural spaces to suck up floodwaters. That's what we're most concerned about in the low country, but also filter out some common contaminants that run off from our rooftops and roadways, little oil leaks in everybody's cars, and heavy metals that are in roof shingles, stuff like that. So today, the topic of our conversation is hydromodification. And when we discuss hydromodification, a simple definition of that is alterations made to waterways, such as rice dikes or phosphate pits. And waterways alter themselves all the time. This map from 1944 shows the Mississippi River and its active floodplain, all of the meanders and bends that the river took over time, altering its course from one end of the floodplain to the other. Very interesting map that shows all of those natural alterations to the river course over time. That's not what we mean when we say hydromodification, the alteration of a water body. What we're referring to with hydromodification is some sort of man-made intervention. And for example, with the Mississippi River, we might think of the levee system that locked the beds and banks in place, constricted flow into the floodplain. And for good reason. There was a lot of valuable resources there in the fertile floodplain, including farms at one time, certainly for those older levee impoundments, but certainly now more infrastructure laden with roadways and homes and other things that were important to preserve. These photos will look familiar to those of you who were with us in March for my previous presentation. Hydromodification was not limited to the low country, as rice cultivation mostly was and phosphate mining was for sure. Hydromodification occurred when land clearing activities occurred and rows of cotton were planted. The water that ran off of formerly forested fields just totally gutted out streams. All across the South Carolina and even the Piedmont region in general, from Virginia to Alabama. And this had devastating downstream impacts. So that's another thing that really goes hand in hand with hydromodification, are the unintended consequences. And as far as legacies of cotton era erosion, we're still dealing with those consequences today. I mentioned, or Judith actually introduced and mentioned, that I'm a restoration ecologist. When faced with sites like this, where you have at once both gullies and streams that are totally clogged with sediment, it is very difficult to know how to move forward with integrity. What does this stream want to be? What would be the highest value to our downstream water bodies? These are not easy answers to untangle. But today we're going to just explore Long Branch and sort of start to think about restoration within the context of this one case study. Thinking about the alterations that have occurred of Long Branch, rice cultivation is our oldest form of extensive hydromodification in the low country. Impoundments were used to skim fresh water off the top of the tidal prism to flood rice fields. The rice would survive, but things like sweet gum wouldn't, so you could seasonally drown the field and ease the burden of maintenance, except if you take in the burden of maintenance of the enslaved labor that had to dig these trenches and build these impoundments. Long Branch has evidence of rice impoundment before. Some of these are probably secondary impoundments built after rice cultivation ended in South Carolina after the Civil War, essentially, or during Reconstruction. These have been maintained over time as fishing ponds or other wildlife features. In fact, my uncle tells a story about catching his $50 bass at Long Branch. He was trespassing on one of their fishing impoundments and DNR caught him and they gave him a $50 ticket. So this is sort of a famous creek in my family's history in West Ashley. After rice cultivation, cotton agriculture persisted. So this photo is from 1879, I believe, and you'll probably recognize a steeple in the background there. And I feel like it just really goes to show what an extensive operation this was in the state, even after the ending of slavery. And so we see that West Ashley was pockmarked with agricultural fields, mostly centered along the railroad line, which now is the West Ashley Greenway. If you're familiar with that, Savannah Highway is let's see if I can get a marker out here. So here's Savannah Highway, Highway 17, and the railroad is just below it. And you can see that these fields hug the railroad, aiding transport at that time. The railroads were expanded during the phosphate mining industry era. And you can see in this map of West Ashley, Long Branch would be somewhere around here. And the whole region was just crisscrossed with railroads. There was a type of soil that is in a crescent band around the Charleston region, Ashley Phosphate Road, in North Charleston along Bees Ferry, and then again, resuming up around Port Royal Sound area in Beaufort, there were phosphate deposits. And so these extensive rail sidings were crisscrossing the whole region, taking advantage of this fertilizer ingredient. And this was an extremely important industry because our soils were so worn out from so many generations of cotton farming that fertilizer was a necessary supplement to the soils that were so exhausted from what is, in fact, quite a greedy plant. It takes a lot of nutrients to produce hardy bales of cotton. And here we already saw the phosphate scars that are still present today along the banks of the Stono River. And there are some smaller, less extensive phosphate pits around Long Branch where we will have our field trip. So we'll get to see up and close what these landscapes look like in person. For a really interesting overview of these hydromodifying practices in South Carolina, this book has become my constant companion. Hurricane Jim Crow came out just last year by an author who studied here in the Southeast, and she will actually be coming to Charleston. I'm very excited to say to do a book reading, and I will be a part of that. So if you are able to attend that book reading, you'll be able to click on this flyer to find out more about attending that coming up. Today in Charleston, our most extensive direct form of hydromodification that is ongoing is perhaps the dredging of the channel through our harbor. Shipping is a major industry of the state. I think I heard at some time that it employs about 1/3 of South Carolinians in some way, direct or indirect. And it has been really picking up as the boats have gotten bigger, we've had to dredge deeper. So I think it was in 1996, they dug the channel 17 feet deep. But that is no longer the depth of the channel. We've had to accommodate larger and larger ships over the year. And very proudly, our channel is now one of the deepest in the eastern seaboard. We have a channel that is over 50 feet deep. But if you remember, in 1997 or so, they were dredging it to 17 feet deep. That was already a far cry from what we had available naturally in the harbor. This map is a Civil War era map showing different stations of barges and other military activities in the harbor, but it also conveys how shallow the mouth of the harbor was. So here's Sullivan's Island, Fort Sumter's right there. And the deepest point is somewhere down here in the corner, and actually my Zoom screen's blocking it. But I think 18 was the biggest number I could find, 18 feet deep. Everything else is much shallower. And in fact, if we look at an even older map, and this was done by dropping chains and counting chain lengths, but it's still in the standard feet measurement that we use today. You can see how much Charleston Harbor has changed. There used to be sandbars everywhere. Look at White Point Gardens was a sandbar that stuck out extensively into the channel. Here we can see that the depth of the harbor was just 4, 5, or 6 feet deep. You probably could have walked across the bottom holding your cell phone dry as you made your way from White Point Gardens to Sullivan's Island. It's just remarkable to imagine how clear the water must have been, and also how shallow the boats must have been to accommodate that. Even the big boats that we had, those schooners, were basically flat bottomed. in order to accommodate these shallow harbor systems that we had here in South Carolina. If you've ever stood at the edge of the ocean and dug your heels in the sand, then perhaps you can imagine what happens when you dig a big hole in a tidally influenced area, and that is that it sucks sediment to fill that hole. So this is one of the unintended consequences of our harbor deepening project, and one that we'll have to reckon with for many generations to come, especially if we're actively maintaining it, which it seems we must. It's such a bastion of our economy here, and it's always been a port town. So the consequence of that, and this is just, Google Street Maps. Here I am on Savannah Highway looking out a beautiful Long Branch Creek here, and and seeing a levee akin to the ones built on the Mississippi River. This seawall is locking Long Branch in place and not allowing it to steal sediment from that shoreline. And this is a very common sight in the Charleston region, is having seawalls, grass, seawalls, and then water. And that is because that hole in our harbor is sucking the sediment from our shorelines, causing them to erode. And this becomes the way that we've responded. It's another sort of hydromodification that is really a consequence of the first. All right. I'm afraid here we go. But more insidiously, a kind of passive hydromodification is just the way that we have totally disrupted the hydrologic regime, or the water cycle, to put it more simply, in the Charleston region. As forests were cleared to lay fields, and fields were cleared to lay concrete, we have drastically altered the way water flows over land. Landscapes that once looked like this, from the old beach dunes turned dry pine savannas, flowing into basins carrying cypress trees and gum trees, to the salt marsh and coastline. We have manipulated the hydrologic regime to make this possible. And these are our homes. This is what my neighborhood looks like. Probably many people in the Charleston region live in a neighborhood much like this, where the green space that exists is kept in turf grass, not necessarily the pine savanna habitat or the bottomland hardwood swamp. We see landscapes that look very much like this. So the only green space, only non-concrete surface is mostly taken up by lawn. And lawn is just not enough to balance the imbalance that our concrete has posed. So instead of having about 10% of our water run across land into tidal creeks, we have the majority of our water running off into tidal creeks like Long Branch that can only hold so much. And we would be remiss not to talk about flooding in a conversation about the hydrology of the Low Country. Here's the data. This is the record of flood events measured at the gauge in Charleston Harbor. And here along the bottom, you can see that this record begins in 1922 at its installation, when we had just 2 events that year. To the present day, we have had 23 flood events so far this year. And the worst season for flooding is actually coming up in September, October, November. So we'll expect to see this, excuse me, this number increase dramatically before the year's over. Certainly some of this is sea level rise. There's no denying it. And we have some really amazing scientists at NOAA based in Charleston studying sea level rise projections. 10 feet, the most extreme, is very unlikely, at least within our lifetimes. However, that's what it'll look like in a 10-foot storm surge. So it's interesting to note the way water pours over our low landscape and what vulnerabilities that poses. And if you'll notice, the peninsula becomes completely covered in water at that 10-foot storm surge mark. But it's not just sea level rise. And if we look at the decadal trends, we can start to pick up on, and this is very cluttered, but it's from NOAA itself, or this NHS database. These are the events per decade in Charleston. So you can see that, in the 20s and 30s, we had less than one event a year on average. In the 40s to 1960, we're seeing a couple events a year, few through the 70s, but starting in the 80s and moving on until present day, it has gotten worse and worse as the decades go by. And it would be interesting, and I didn't have time to do this myself, but comparing this data and really plugging it into population growth, impervious cover growth in the Charleston region, I'm sure that this is in large part a result of that hydrologic regime change, that concrete that's covering up our soil, pushing all of that water into tidal creeks rather than sucking it up into trees after the storm and putting it back into the sky. And if we really look at, 1989 is when Hugo hit. I think it says 5 events that year. That was, a devastating storm for Charleston, and yet a blip on the radar as far as the kinds of flooding that we're seeing these days. So really interesting to note the power of tree cover to mitigate flooding in Charleston. And that's really the work of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, is reversing this trend from concrete-laden suburbia to treed streets that can start to mitigate the effects of stormwater flooding in particular. So rather than having landscapes that look like this, and this is just another typical corner in the neighborhood of Long Branch, we should really be striving to have landscapes that look like this. And this may be a familiar photograph for you because it just popped up in the Post and Courier a few days ago under the headline, "West Ashley homeowner embrace native planting, Charleston County threatened to fine him." Twice, as it turns out. It's a very stimulating read. And I was sort of surprised. I guess he must be in an unincorporated area because the city of Charleston also has fines associated with unsightly growth, which is defined as unsightly, unsanitary growth of grass, bushes, shrubs, trees, weeds, vines, leaves, etc. And I just can't imagine what's unsanitary about trees, but apparently they're just terribly unsanitary, and so they go under chapter 14 on garbage, trash, and refuse. And the rest of this ordinance is about managing litter and cleaning out storm drains and very common sense practices. But we have laws on the books against having landscapes that are unsightly. And I really would like to propose, with thinking about these ordinances that are keeping homeowners from doing something like this on their property, that unsightliness is in the eye of the beholder. And you can imagine that other members of our community, including pollinators and birds and other living creatures that consider themselves Charlestonian, might have a different opinion of what landscape looks unsightly to them and where they would prefer to live. So just trying to rethink the way that we choose aesthetics or formal design over functional design. And here's just another graphic that really portrays the issues that we're causing when our open space is dominated by turf grass, which is circled there in red, versus other native plants that have deeper roots and therefore penetrate the soil, bringing water down deeper into the soil. You can imagine there's a comparable sequestration of carbon from plants that have these deeper roots. There's a comparable greater ability to filter out pollutants from the air. Turf grass is probably the worst thing that we could plant in our open spaces. And yet it is the dominant regime for all of our green spaces in Charleston. Nature-based solutions. This is sort of the terminology that's cropped up recently in the field to talk about tree plantings and rain gardens and other sort of vegetation-oriented stormwater control measures. And green infrastructure is becoming a little out of fashion, but it's another word that's been used to suggest, instead of concrete and pipes, trees that put water back into the sky, so on and so forth. When thinking about nature-based solutions or green infrastructure, whatever you'd like to call it, I think it's very important for us to really consider what is a resilient approach and what is a robust approach. And in sort of helping you understand what I mean by that, I thought I would just list a few problems that nature-based solutions seek to ameliorate. And so a solution implies a problem. Here are a few of them. So flooding, of course. There's shoreline erosion we discussed with the harbor deepening project. And then another one that's been more in the news lately is the urban heat island effect. And certainly it is July. I feel August coming. We're all concerned about the urban heat island effect. This map was actually generated from data collected by our local MUSC. They sent out volunteers with thermometers and sort of mapped heat across the city or the region, really. And this just shows that wherever pavement is prevalent, sure enough, it is much hotter there than in areas that have more wild places. And even neighborhoods in West Ashley, they highlight that had more conserved open space because it was undevelopable, perhaps. They had cooler temperatures as a result in the surrounding communities. So where there's a lot of concrete, like here, where 526 conjoins with Sam Rittenberg and 17, that's where you have, this is Costco right in here. That's where you have these pulses of heat in our city. So a nature-based solution that is resilient is to consider how to incorporate shade and shade from trees in particular as they take water out of the air, evaporate it back into the atmosphere, take water out of the soil, evaporate it into the atmosphere. That has an evapotranspirative cooling effect. But it also shades pavement. So really thinking about green roofs. And MUSC has been a great example of how to weave nature into the urban environment. So walking around their campus, you'll see all sorts of gardens and interesting planters. They're really embracing this nature-based approach. How are tree plantings resilient and not robust? Well, a robust approach to create shade, for example, would be to encapsulate the Charleston region in a dome and use a dimmer switch to provide shade. So really thinking about robust approaches, we're talking about huge infrastructure investments, something that will be ludicrous to maintain, that will mortgage our future, that is just a system with multiple redundancies and a huge risk of failure. That's a little bit of a silly one, but if we think about flooding, City of Charleston has been just throwing everything it can at the issue of flooding. And so an example of a robust approach is the diesel-powered stormwater pumps that are going in under the crosstown. Those have fail-safes. They're built to last. They have multiple redundancies. I'm sure this is a huge infrastructure investment with a great cost of failure. If we did end up building a concrete wall around the peninsula that's been proposed, that is a robust approach. It will stop every inch of water in a storm surge up to 12 feet from entering our city. But again, it's a huge investment in infrastructure, and it has a huge cost of failure. To a lesser extent, thinking about shoreline erosion, same thing with the seawall. If you put in a seawall that has a very high cost to the homeowner, and if it fails, if that barricade falls in and causes erosion, it's all going to fall in at once. It's probably going to cause problems for your neighbors. That has a huge cost of failure. Whereas the nature-based alternative, which is these oyster reefs and Spartina plantings, they are at their worst the day of installation and only grow stronger over time. Disturbance through a hurricane would actually probably end up delivering sediment. It would squish some of the plants, but they would come back. So that's a resilient, more flexible approach to managing shoreline erosion. And I hate to belabor this point, but resilient is a word that's being used a lot more lately. And I think it's just really important to keep in mind when someone is using the word resilience to mean robust, because that's something we'll really have to guard ourselves against getting confused about in the future as we become more tied up as our budgets become more tied up with robust approaches that require maintenance and have a high cost of failure. Fortunately, everyone is getting on board with this stuff. So this is from the master plan for West Ashley. There's a whole chapter on green infrastructure and sustainability. This came out years ago and is brilliant. They have a whole green infrastructure toolkit, and they call out places in the city where they think that these different green infrastructure improvements would be appropriate. So if you happen to live in West Ashley, it would be really worthwhile to click on these pictures when you get the PDF and explore what they've proposed for your neighborhood. And amazingly, Plan West Ashley came out before the Dutch Dialogues report. So if you recall, several years ago, we brought in some folks from abroad as well as from New Orleans and sat down with local engineers and planners and really took a look at flooding in the city and worked on some suggestions for the city of Charleston to use as it moved forward. And they even have some really interesting ideas about issues specific to Charleston, such as what to do with the phosphate mine pits. And there are just some really creative solutions that were outlined in that report, worth a close look because they broke it up by region. So James Island has its own section in the Dutch Dialogues report, as does the peninsula, and so on and so forth. So you can really look at what they suggested for your own neighborhood in Charleston. This was in advance of the city completing its comprehensive planning process, which, the city 2020 plan came out in 2021, I believe, but it was well informed by the Dutch Dialogues report. And in their land and water analysis, which was sort of a 1,000-page appendix to the city plan, they go into great detail, neighborhood by neighborhood. And again, some of these maps that they have in that plan show the houses, the buildings, so you can really look down to a lot level of detail at your own home and what's going on in the surrounding hydrology. And what they did was they looked at flood maps, certainly, but also soil maps and all sorts of other land and water techniques of analysis. And they came up with nature-based zoning, essentially. And this was just a recommendation for the city to use as it revamps it or makes planning and zoning decisions for the next 10 years. And so here you can see Long Branch is the creek, sort of on the left end of the frame. Long Branch and the surrounding neighborhoods are mostly at great risk. And there's some high ground in West Ashley. The plan points out over and over again that high ground doesn't mean grow here. Those areas where the soil is sandiest and highest are also where we can infiltrate the most water down into groundwater instead of having it run off into creeks. So it's not necessary. It's always more complicated than a 4-colored bar graph can simplify it to, but there's still some really interesting recommendations that came out of this report. And if you are in the Charleston region, they have different landscape typologies that they use to describe these different zones, what it would have looked like before we built on top of it, and even plant lists. So if you're down to restore the hydrologic natural regime to your yard, you can go to this resource and find a list of things that are commonly commercially available at Roots and Shoots at your local nursery, and plant those things in your yard, and they will likely thrive because your yard is the natural landscape typology that we would see these plants in the natural setting. They also, like Plan West Ashley, sort of rated different green infrastructure measures, including things that are huge investments such as green roofs, to simple things, open channel system that means a ditch that has plants growing in it. Some really just very basic planting plans are associated with some of these. Others are a little more complicated, but they do rate them as far as how much would these things really work in that given zone. And now the county is also going through its comprehensive planning process. And this is an important one to y'all's mission, which was right at the beginning of this presentation. that we should be involved in this. We are residents, or most of us, I presume, on this call are residents of Charleston County and should get involved in their planning process. And just glimpsing at some of the things that they've proposed to be tenets of their plan, I'm seeing that they are also on board with green infrastructure and really bolstering nature-based solutions within our region. And interestingly, this one also suggests a second one that, you know, they want to promote sustainable landscaping that minimizes the use of fertilizers and pesticides. That's native plants. That's what that man planted in his garden that he ended up triggering an ordinance and a fee for. So the county is actually becoming more aware of this issue, and hopefully with its planning process, we'll see more yards like the gentleman in that Post and Courier article that we've brought up before. You can get involved. You can look at their draft plan. You can look at, they have some, you know, a little less clunky flyers and things on their website so that you can inform yourself before hopefully being able to attend a workshop. And there's just a couple left this summer, but it would be an opportunity to engage with planners and ask questions, and also let them know what's most important for you in your neighborhood. And wherever you are in South Carolina, we have this new Office of Resilience. They have also just published a planning document with many, many recommendations that also put nature-based solutions at the fore. There's some really incredible information about population trends by county, about how, you know, projected change in days above 95 degrees, as this map shows, and other issues region by region that may become important for comprehensive plans of those municipalities in the near future. So this is a meaty document, but an interesting one to glance through. And yet, you know, all of the planning that we have from our local municipality to our state agencies, the thing that I hope you take away from today is that robust solutions can cost a lot of money. They can have unintended consequences, but resilient ones can actually be quite simple, so simple that they get overlooked, such as using trees to create shade to mitigate an urban heat island effect. And so one person with their own two hands in their own backyard can actually do quite a lot. And this is where I see nature-based solutions as kind of a democratization of engineering. Everyone can make a difference, and even one tree holds gallons of water on its leaves every time it rains and soaks those into the ground slowly through its drip line, penetrates it deep into the soil, and then sucks it out, puts it back into the atmosphere, cooling us in the days after a storm. And further democratizing nature-based solutions, you don't actually have to look far to get plants for free. This doesn't have to mean calling in a landscape designer, even if you have a brown thumb or consider yourself to. Native plants thrive in our landscape. And so ignore the Japanese azalea for a second here that's got that nice label, and ignore the English boxwood hedge. Here, growing in the leaves all by themselves with no help from a gardener, are live oak saplings whose acorns dropped from the live oaks of the cistern yard at the College of Charleston. And who wouldn't want a College of Charleston seedling growing in their front yard? So really, if you go and investigate today under your own hedges, I'm sure you'll find many seedlings that birds planted that you can start today for free to start replacing that lawn. On our field trip, I'll go into more detail about why native plants versus invasive plants, but I did want to leave you with just another little data point, which is how oaks compare to some common landscaping plants as far as how many caterpillars they support. And caterpillars, being the base of the food chain, turn into all sorts of other services for us, including pollination services, but also feeding the birds. So instead of putting sunflower seeds in your yard, you can plant an oak tree, and the birds will be thrilled in spring when they have their nestlings, because baby birds can't eat sunflower seeds. They can basically only eat caterpillars, unless it's off chance we're talking about a heron, in which case fish become an opportunity as well. But most baby birds can only eat soft-bodied insects. And if we have a landscape that is filled with crepe myrtle and privet, which is very common in our neighborhoods here in West Ashley, then this is how many bird species you will support. That's how many caterpillar species it will support. It's next to 0. I think privet has 2, crepe myrtle has 1 caterpillar that's adapted the ability to chew on its leaves. So instead of just thinking about what a live oak does to capture rain in its leaves and drip it into the ground and send it back up into the sky, to restore that hydrologic flow regime, to remedy the effects of the urban environment and how it casts water off into overburdened tidal creeks, we also just really have to be concerned about the biodiversity loss that we've experienced in West Ashley while planting so many things that are inedible, unsightly to pollinators everywhere and birds. With that, I will just point out that you still have time to register, if you have not already, for a visit to Long Branch this Saturday. And I'm going to go ahead and just click on this link to show you that this link also has just some really good details about where to meet and when. In fact, I believe that we'll also have, here we go, a link to a map that will show you exactly where you need to go. And you could even plug this into your phone and it will give you directions to our meeting point. So we're coming here to the end of East Estates Boulevard and walking this area of the woods where that battery is. Just beautiful oak forest with lots of wonderful native plants and really good sightline for phosphate scars, rice impoundments, and other things of interest for given our talk today on hydromodification. But again, we'll also do a little bit of a deeper dive into native and invasive plants. There's plenty of examples of both on that site. So I hope you'll be able to join that. And then if not, or if you're even more interested, I'm going to do a very similar field trip with the Sierra Club by bike. It's July, it's hot. I figured we could use the breeze of a bike ride. And that will go along the old rail line through West Ashley to Hummock Island at Stono River County Park. So if you'd like to join us for that, you're welcome to sign up at this link as well. Cool. And then, as I mentioned, most all of the pictures, unless I missed a spot, are clickable links to further resources. But here's some more. So if you're interested by something that you learned about today, or some of them that I didn't have time to show, there's some really interesting resources at these links. Something that I keep compiling for future talks, including some pictures of Long Branch itself. So you'll be able to use that end of the presentation in the PDF to learn more. And on that note, I will stop sharing this. You'll get an email with all of this information and turn it back to Judith.
Rebecca, that was absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
You might be.
Am I? I don't, yeah, she can hear me. That was really fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to Saturday. I mean, it just gave the whole breadth of what's gone on here. Wonderful. So we can do a question and answer session now.
People can put their questions in the chat.
Okay.
And that you'll start them off with some questions
Right.
that were already
Right.
submitted.
So the way to do that is to click on chat. Most of you probably know how to do it, and put your question in there, and then I'll review them as they come up and read them. And then Rebecca can answer. So how serious, Rebecca, is the fertilizer and insecticide runoff into this creek as it winds its way through subdivisions and probably past some golf courses?
Yeah, that's right. And I neglected to point out, but one big agricultural field hasn't changed since West Ashley was built out, and that's now the USDA Vegetable Lab. Perhaps you've driven by it on your way down to Savannah on Savannah Highway. There's Clemson Extension on one side and the Vegetable Lab on the other. So there is still active agriculture. And that's where most people really think about fertilizers or pesticides running off. But I don't know about you guys. I'm shocked to learn sometimes how ubiquitous it is for people to spray the plants in their yard. And landscaping companies, of course, seasonally will put down those little fertilizer pellets in grass. But it really adds up. So all of the suburban areas may have the same effect as the more highly regulated agricultural fields that aren't allowed to spray very intensely. When you're buying something from Lowe's and pouring it on your lawn, no one's really looking. But the agricultural industry usually is highly restricted. We know that there are stormwater ponds in one of the newer developments off the creek that are experiencing harmful algae blooms, which is an indication of heavy fertilizer use. So those houses, lawns, fertilizers that are running into that pond are feeding these microscopic algae. And the trouble with the algae is that they suck the oxygen out of the air, so no fish will survive in those waters. The alligators start to get really hungry, so think about that. And the algae off gas as they bloom and die toxins that become airborne. And we're just starting to learn about all of the health ramifications for those toxins. This is an increasingly common issue in the Charleston region. Certainly we've known about it for years in Florida, but our region is starting to really hurt from that now too. Something to be aware of wherever you live in the Charleston region. There's usually a stormwater pond nearby.
There is one. Let's see.
Let's see it.
I don't, do you see it? A question?
No, but go ahead and ask you another question.
The other thing that I have read about a lot over the years as a master naturalist is the issue of pet waste, and which I suppose technically is a type of fertilizer, the way it breaks down. And do riparian buffers, presumably out of native plants, make a difference with something like that?
Absolutely, yeah. And one of the reasons why stormwater ponds are such a trap, and we're seeing harmful algae blooms in ponds, but not necessarily our tidal creeks, is that they have no vegetated buffer. So you were just saying riparian zone, but meaning it's lawn, water. And so there's not really very many plant roots there to take up those excess nutrients and turn them into leaves. Whereas our tidal creeks usually have a pretty good buffer zone, trees alongside them, sometimes lawns and seawalls and things like that. But often, at least for smaller creek systems, there's really good amount of plant roots there interacting in the water to pull out those nutrients. Pet waste, you know, I felt like that was a red herring for a while until I learned that apparently dog poop has like 8 times more bacteria in it than our own waste. But you know, I would certainly, we should pick up after our pets. There are other things that are causing the problem worse than the dog poop that is on your neighbor's lawn. It is the fact that Plum Island gets overwhelmed when it floods, and raw sewage ends up coming out of our storm sewer systems into the nearby rivers and lakes. There is, or I shouldn't even say lakes, streams. There are septic tank issues in older neighborhoods or ones that are in unincorporated areas. That's a huge cost to a homeowner to switch from septic. So, you know, certainly if you have a dog, picking up the waste is a good measure, especially if it's on lawn where that's just going to sort of melt into storm drain when it rains. But really, it's, you know, the larger issues are more important for us to be talking openly about, and that's septic and our faulty water treatment facility. It's that's another thing that is changing in America, but it will probably be a long time before we see those changes in South Carolina. There are things that sewage treatment plants can do to use nature-based solutions in times of flood, or just as an extra filter when it's not flooding. But that's a retrofit that would take a lot for Plum Island to consider doing.
Thank you. So
I'm not seeing
there is a question, but we haven't been able to pull it up, right?
I didn't see one.
Oh, it says one here. Okay, but I can't pull it up. So do you have time for one more question?
Absolutely, I'm here.
Okay. All right. So there's been a lot written in the garden books and the lawn books, etc., about rain gardens and rain barrels. And are these really effective?
Definitely, they are so effective. Rain barrels are appropriate for any home, whether you have gutters or not. It's amazing how much water you can get to follow a chain from your roof edge to a barrel. And so they have beautiful rain chains that are little cup shapes, but literally a chain will funnel water from the edge of your roof to a rain barrel. And that's 50 gallons per barrel. So in a 1-inch rain, 1,000 square foot roof produces 600 gallons. Bad at math, hold on, 560. It's like 12 rain barrels full, in a 1-inch rain. And we get 1-inch rain all the time. So really, we can't have enough rain barrels, although I will say a full rain barrel is as good as no rain barrel. But certainly that would be a way to offset the impact of your own roof and its contribution to overburdened storm drains and tidal creeks. And then rain gardens also aren't appropriate everywhere, but it's something that I think is like that if everyone who had sandy soil had a rain garden, it would make such a dent in our flooding issues. And so rain garden, simply put, is a hole that you dig in your yard and then you fill it with native plants that can withstand drought or flood. And that's a lot of our plants in South Carolina. So really easy to maintain, a great way to replace your lawn. And then the gutter from your rain barrel, the overflow from your rain barrel or from your roof can be fed into that garden. Maybe it's just where the water flows naturally over your yard and it fills that rain garden up. There's a shallow berm around it. And actually, I'll just show you a great resource that just came out from Sea Grant. They have an awesome publication. I don't know if you all are familiar. And they did this whole segment on rain gardens, just came out, literally in the last week, I think, and other things that you can do in and around your own home to capture that water on your land. So that's, oh, I'm not sharing my screen. I'm so sorry, y'all. There it is. Okay, so here we have a link in the resources. It is an article on gardens for stormwater and habitat with lots of great other links. And it's the most recent Sea Grant Consortium publication on rain gardens. So if you are interested, if you know that you have sandy soil or you think your yard might be suitable, this is just a really interesting read that tells you all sorts of information. And at the end of it, I noticed it just has like some of the best publications that have been put out on stormwater in the Charleston region. So, you have a native plant database, Charleston Rainproof Program. They used to give out little mini grants. I think it got cut out of the budget, but hopefully they'll bring that back. And other just resources that we mentioned today, as well as ones that I didn't have time for, but that are just excellent resources for nature-based solutions. So I would definitely, if you read one thing after today, make it the Sea Grant article, because it really has a lot of just very simple things, including what we already mentioned, cleaning up pet waste, but just some great resources as well. So definitely take a look at that.
Can't hear you. You have
We're
to
gonna
come.
send the phone back in.
Okay, right. Rebecca, thank you ever so much. And we really look forward to seeing you on Saturday morning, right?
I can't wait.
And, let's see, I'm supposed to, Rebecca's already given us the information about the trip and where to click, get the map and so forth. But you will also be receiving a, email from Kara with that information in it, as well as a verbal walk or drive from 17 to the place for those folks who don't want to mess with their phones. Thank you for putting that together, Rebecca. You must have had to drive it to get the streets and all that. There are lots of links that Rebecca has left for you, and it has been great. Thanks so much for attending, and hopefully those of you who had signed up will be able to make it on Saturday, and we can gather afterwards and have lunch and kind of complete the entire conversation on all of this. So again, Rebecca, thank you very much. And I will see you at 8, a little before 8:30 on Saturday. Did Vicky?
We can just close out now.
So Vicky's my coach, because I haven't done this before. So I was just checking to see if there was something else I needed to do. Anyway, thanks so much, and see you Saturday morning. Thank you.
And then go
Thank
down
you.
to leave and just click leave.
And not doing anything.
Okay.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
okay.
End meeting for all,
Uh,
or leave meeting.
Actually, wait a second. We can, yeah, leave meeting.
Okay.
I was gonna say a couple words to.
You want to?
No, that's okay, Mickey, stay.
Well, Judy Pepper's still there. Mickey's on, but gone. She must have forgot to turn it.
Okay, no, go ahead and.
Here she